thank you for joining the Together We Care lecture series. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to mention that this event is being recorded. However, the question and answer period is going to be cut from the recording for confidentiality reasons. Our guest tonight is Matt Del Vecchio. Matt founded Lianas Senior Transition Support in 2015 in an effort to provide guidance to families and their loved ones through the aging process and navigating their life transitions. He is a certified professional consultant on aging, CPCA. He is also the host of Life Unrehearsed, a popular weekly radio show on CJAD 800 in Montreal. Matt is also a supporter of many local community organizations and is on the board of directors of Nova West Island. He and his wife, Stefanie Cadou, are compassionate advocates for the health and well-being of older persons. They are frequent guest speakers providing insights and knowledge to adult children and their parents. Matt and Stefanie, along with their team of Lianas Senior Advisors, are the go-to resource for senior living communities, elder care planning, property sales of seniors in transition, downsizing, and psychosocial assessments for the homologation of mandates or private tutorship. Before we continue, we would like to remind you one more time to mute your microphone on Zoom, and that if you have any questions, you can either write them down in the chat box on Zoom or wait until the end of the event to ask them. And now I'd like to invite Matt to start his presentation.
All right, Caitlin, thank you very much for the nice introduction and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking a little time on during your evening here. And very proud and humbled to be asked to present to you today's topic, which is all you need to know about transitioning into a public or private residence. We're going to tackle a bunch of topics and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So as Caitlin mentioned, I do have a weekly radio show on CJAD. I'm just celebrating my 6-year anniversary next week, actually. It's called Life Unrehearsed and dealing with a lot of the challenges of people. And I try to bring on a whole host of guests from professionals to and people like you and I and try to find how people cope with those curveballs thrown to you in life, because life is indeed unrehearsed. And this particular topic is actually quite popular. I've raised this topic on my show several times over the last few years, and it always gets a lot of interest. So I'm glad to share this presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to get a little bit out of it. So this evening, we're going to talk about several things. Starting it off with about aging in place. What are the senior living options and what's the difference between public and private residences? I'll try to define that for you. And what's the process to get into a public residence and how do you get evaluated? And an explanation of the different types of the public residences out there. I get asked a lot about waiting times and costs, so I'll address that as well. And I also get asked about any suggestions for transitioning into a residence, because that's always very challenging, emotional, heartfelt. And so I'll be addressing that. And at the end, we'll open it up to everyone for some Q&A. All right, I guess you're all aware of this. The population is aging, and the next 20 years will see the fastest growth of our population aged 65 and over. In fact, it will increase by about 50% over the next 20 years of those getting 65 and over. So we're getting a lot of these questions asked with our aging population, and hopefully tonight will be a bit informative, which you can keep with you, not just for now, but in the future, and maybe to tell your friends and neighbors, because our population is indeed aging and we all need some help. We know our healthcare system is not great, and we could use everything we can do to help out. So what I'd like to start with is aging in place. You know, the topic is public residences and how to get in, but the reality is all of us, I think I speak for everyone, where we want to try to age in place, stay in our home or condo or apartment for as long as we possibly can. And we want to encourage that. And so in order for that to happen, we're talking about creating a safe and secure environment. And many of you are probably dealing with situations where there's a lot of moving parts and over years, especially with cognitive decline, issues with dementia and Alzheimer's, your world is changing all the time, and it could change very quickly, or it could be even years how things are changing. But you do want to create a safe and secure environment People are making home modifications, particularly when we're dealing with mobility issues, even appliance issues with the stove being left on and so on. So people are making home modifications to age in place longer. And what's obviously very important is the ability to provide proper care. And as caregivers, we have to rely on family, yourselves. We do have our healthcare system. Some of you are already getting CLSC support. Probably many of you have experienced the difficulties the CLSC is going through in trying to be able to provide people with support. The system is stretched to the absolute maximum. And as a result, some families have to resort to even private home care. But the bottom line is you do want to be able to provide proper care for your loved ones. And the last point here, which is probably the most important, caregiver support. It's the old analogy of the oxygen mask in the airplane, right? You do need to take care of yourself. And most of my conversations are with spouses or with adult children, and they are at their wits' end. And it's very, very challenging for a lot of people out there. We understand that. And we always have to stress that take care of yourself, because God forbid you get sick, then it's a more difficult situation. At a certain point in time, though, aging in place starts to become maybe not feasible. And families, this is where it gets tough, and emotional, because there may be reached a time where you need to investigate alternative senior living options for a loved one. So in general, I'd like to categorize what your options are if a move were to be made. And I'd like to start off with the general categories. You might have heard of the term RPA, which stands for Résidence Privée pour Aînés. You and I would know this as a retirement home or a senior's residence, and they tend to be categorized in a few different categories. Independent living, where you'll have a full kitchen and laundry, and you could do your best of both worlds. You're living in a condo type environment, but you have all the amenities of a senior living community, common areas, and maybe a dépanneur and pharmacy and dining room. There are also assisted living. Traditionally in Quebec, the term assisted living would mean less than 3 hours of daily care. This would be residences that have the option where they would have a nurse on staff, even on the floor. They can provide services like dressing and undressing, maybe even assistance with toileting and medication management. That's assisted living. And then memory care, more of a niche oriented, which is quite popular with this audience today, where there are residences that is more than just assisted living, but residences that specialize with staff understanding memory care, Alzheimer's, the whole dementia umbrella. In Quebec, RPAs, there are only private options available, okay, in these categories. The next level is what we would call nursing home, or CHSLDs, Centre d'Hébergement de Soins de Longue Durée. That's what CHSLD stands for. Or the level below CHSLD in Quebec is known as an RI, Ressources Intermédiaires. I'm going to define both of those later on in this presentation. But essentially, we're looking at long-term care. It usually means more than 3 hours of daily care. And once we start getting to this nursing home level, you now run into this option of being able to get into a public residence within the government system. There are also some private options as well, and I'm going to define both of those as we move along here. So in order to get into a public residence in Quebec, again, there's only long-term care options. You must go through your local CLSC. That's the process to get admission into a public residence. So effectively, you contact your local CLSC and you want to request an evaluation for potential placement into a public residence. Now, when going through that process, if some of you have been through it, it's not an easy process to contact your local CLSC. my hope is that maybe you're already getting some CLSC services and you may already have a caseworker. Fantastic. You can approach that person. But if you're cold calling, it's a little bit more difficult. But when you request an evaluation for placement, it's extremely important to communicate your situation. And don't be afraid to really lay it on thick. And what I mean by that, truly explain the situation. If you are a spouse or a caregiver and it is just not feasible anymore, if there are high-risk situations with stairs or flight risks, wandering, maybe there's aggressivity, both physical or verbal, and it's just becoming too much, make sure you verbalize that and communicate your situation as effectively as you can. Now, what happens if you are lucky enough to have an evaluator from the CLSC go to the house wherever your loved one lives? They start an evaluation process. And what happens in that evaluation process, in general, not always, but very often, the evaluation uses what they call a SMAF evaluation. SMAF is translated, it's an acronym for Système de Mesure de l'Autonomie Fonctionnelle. Essentially, it's a mechanism to test how functional, how independent your loved one can live in their existing environment. And they do this. It's a very lengthy evaluation, dozens of pages. And at the end of it all, it creates a score. And I know there's a lot of information here. I'll go through this with you briefly, but essentially in the evaluation, you're going to get a score from 0 to 14. Category 1 in the SMAF profiles is a score of 1, 2, and 3. And it's predominantly a loss in what they call instrumental activities of daily life or living, IADLs. This is, can they get along on their own? Can they dress on their own? No, they can't. Can they toilet on their own? Can they eat on their own? Can they cook? Can they pay bills? And category 1 measures that. 1, 2, and 3 would be considered a category 1. Category 2 is more increased mobility challenges. So it's related more to a physical result. So there are scores ranging from 4, 6, and 9, 9 being pretty significant mobility challenges. Category 3 is more on the cognitive side of things. You get scores of 5, 7, 8, and 10. And this is relating to the loss in cognitive functions. And there's different degrees of loss in cognitive functions. And then the highest level, in what we call category 4, is 11, 12, 13, and 14. And that's usually a mix of both physical and cognitive function. Okay, so it's not always used as SMAF in the evaluations, but it is quite popular. Essentially, in any evaluation done by the CLSC, what they're trying to determine is how vulnerable or not so vulnerable the individual is. Now, once the evaluation is done, you're going to get the results. And then that's when they're going to determine the next steps. And so as an example, if you get the evaluation done, you will see that it will either be don't qualify at all because the care needs aren't high enough, or if you do qualify, it's probably in the public system now I'm talking about, it's either going to be a CHSLD category or an RI, Ressources Intermédiaires. What we mean by CHSLD, Centre d'Hébergement de Soins de Longue Durée, this is typically a SMAF score of 10 to 14. Now, that's not written in stone because every CLSC will be a little bit different, but I'm generalizing for you. If you get a SMAF score of 10 to 14, that's a high level of care. Now we're beyond 3 hours of daily care. This would mean that you would qualify for a public CHSLD. An RI would typically mean a SMAF score of between 8 and 9. So not as high, but still a pretty good degree of care that is required, and most likely someone who certainly can't live on their own. In Quebec, there are more CHSLDs than RIs, and specifically in Montreal, there's not that many RIs. You know, we're probably talking 8 to 12 RIs, many more CHSLDs. Okay, just to give you an idea of what's out there. Now, going through the process, we get evaluated. Yes, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so qualifies, let's say, for a CHSLD. What they will do, what the CLSC will do, will say, okay, here are the residences that have permanent beds for your loved one. And it will usually be in a geography of within your CLSC district. And they'll say, okay, here are the 6 CHSLDs that you could choose from, and you would choose one of them as being your priority number 1. Some of them will allow you to do a priority number 2 or even number 3. Most will just say, okay, which one would you like your loved one to go to for a permanent bed? Versus a transition bed, okay? Because there are waiting times to get into a permanent bed, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. So what happens is we have this vulnerable population. Great, we've qualified, we've been evaluated, my loved one can now get into a public residence, but now we have to wait, sometimes substantially. And what happens is they will either try to arm you with some additional home support by the CLSC, or they will try to go into a transition bed. The transition bed, unfortunately, you don't have any say as to which transition bed your loved one could go through. There's a whole triage system in place with the government, the healthcare system, and it's kind of a first come, first serve, and that's where the transition bed will be. Sometimes it's not even in your own geography, in your own CLSC district. But know that that there are these transition beds while waiting to get into your permanent bed, which would be your first choice. So in terms of waiting times, we get asked this question a lot. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the CLSC. It actually varies by region. But I want to point out that it's usually based on a priority level. It's not first come, first serve. So those with a SMAF score of 14 will get bumped up on the priority level versus those on a SMAF score of 8 or 9. Okay, and it will vary by region. Typically speaking, I know this is a big range, but it would be between 6 months to 3 years to get into a permanent bed in a public residence. Okay, so count on that. Let's say an average of a year, but it will vary by your geography, your district. I get asked a lot about costs. So these are the 2023 rates for a public residence anywhere in the province of Quebec. So for an individual room, which would include a bathroom, the cost today is $2,079.90. And that's pretty well all in, all your care, all your housekeeping, your medication management, your laundry, heating and electricity. Extra costs, though, would be things like sometimes you need to pay for your TV or for your internet or for your telephone. Obviously, if you want to get some personal hygiene services, if you want to get a haircut done or your nails done, then those are additional services. But this would include the care, the toileting, the dressing, the undressing, the meals, the assistance with transfers. So your max cost is $2,079.90. That's a private room. The next level with 2 to a room is $1,737.60 per month. And the other one, 3 beds or more, is $1,294.50. However, since the pandemic, these are very, very rare. You'll rarely have that option to do a 3 or a 4 bed option. Okay, and just to let you know in terms of how much that was an increase from 2022, it was a 4% increase. I get asked the question, my goodness, my wife, my husband, my partner, my spouse, my dad, grandmother, they can't even afford these rates. Know that in Quebec, it's civil code. We are in a very social society. You will never have to pay more than the income you are bringing in. So for example, if you've exhausted all your assets, you have nothing in the bank account, you have no RSPs, you don't have any assets, all you have is your basic pension, and it's not enough to cover your rent, you're allowed to apply to the government, and they will never charge you more than what you're bringing in. In fact, by law, they have to leave you a couple $100s a month for some disposable income for daily costs. Okay, so know in Quebec that you're protected. They can't go after your children or your grandchildren for extra income. This is about your income and your revenues. Now, I often get asked, and I wanted to put in a couple slides in here because some families are at a stage where, okay, well, maybe I need to look at some private options. And so just to explain once again, if we're talking independent or assisted living or memory care, RPAs, there are no public options, so you could only go private. And there are many of them, more private RPAs than there are public residences. And then there are nursing homes, long-term care that are also private that can provide more than 3 hours of daily care. And they'll range from, full, big residences. What's becoming very popular now are the smaller home operated, owner operated residences that can provide care, 8 to 12 people. They're getting quite popular in the private sector as well. Just to explain in terms of the search, it does get time consuming. It's very often the first time experience for individuals. There's lots of questions and information. A lot of families, if they want to explore the private sector, they'll hire an agency. In fact, that Lianas Senior Transition Support is an agency. There are no charges to families. We go on tours, we narrow down the best options. So know that besides Lianas, there are other companies out there that can provide you with free of charge service. And a lot of Montrealers do that. Just to give you an idea, so you can compare costs from public to private. Obviously, private is more expensive. Independent living can range from anywhere from $1,100 to about $3,500 per month. Assisted living, where now we're getting into all meals included, housekeeping, laundry, assistance with dressing and bathing, they can range from $3,000 to $6,000 per month. And now long-term care, it can get up there, absolutely, ranging from $4,000 to $9,000 per month, some even a little higher, where you're getting full care. Now, know that in the private sector, the government provides monthly tax subsidies. If you are over 70 years old, you automatically qualify for that. And it will range at around 10 to 15% of your monthly income. So I'll just go back here. Let's say $3,000 is what you're paying in the private sector. The government will deposit in your bank account somewhere around $400 per month, 10 to 15%. And you automatically qualify for that if you're 70 years old. There are some income scales. If you are making annual revenue of over $65,000, and I don't want to get too into the weeds too much, but know that there is money there from the government. Basically, the government has said, hey, there's no more room in the public residences. The waiting lists are too long. Let's support the private sector in the meantime. So just wrapping this up, I often get asked about, okay, Matt, you know what, this is so difficult. I can't imagine my loved one or my husband or my wife or my parent going into a CHSLD. It's heart-wrenching. And yes, it is. It's very emotional. And so I always like to make these recommendations because we can't sugarcoat it. It is tough. It's not easy. So here are a few tips for you. We like to personalize the room. We always encourage that, okay? Sometimes they're furnished. Sometimes you could put in your own furniture. Usually what's not debatable is that the CHSLDs, public residences, will include a hospital bed, but they encourage you from everything from furniture to paintings to memories. Have that room all set up for your loved one for the day of transition. Meet with the staff, because what you want to do is they're going to customize a care plan for your loved one. And this is the time to share your loved one's likes and dislikes, what their history and culture is. Try to make it as homey as possible, and for the staff to understand who and what your loved one is all about. I also encourage you to communicate with your loved one. And I fully realize that sometimes communication with a loved one, especially someone with a dementia related disease, on the heavier side, it might not be the easiest to communicate, but assume they're going to be worried and anxious and nervous and they hear the talk behind the scenes. Always best to try to communicate with your loved one and give them the comfort of at least explaining that a transition is in place and that they will be in good hands. We always like to encourage you to be present, a family member, a friend, to be present during this transition phase. And I have in brackets here, but not always. Always have the conversations with the residents, particularly if we're dealing in a situation with high levels of cognitive challenges. Sometimes the strategy might even be best where you're holding back by a few days so your loved one can get accustomed to their new environment. And other times it's encouraged where you're there all the time. So we do want you to be present, but these are good conversations to have with the residents, because there are some situations where your presence, although you love your loved one, you may actually be doing a little bit of harm in the beginning stages by being too present, because when you leave that room, then the anxiety and panic kicks in. So these are very good conversations to have with the head nurse at a residence to discuss the best strategy for a transition. And of course, I put in there, take care of yourself. So often, the stress and the anxiety is actually on the caregiver because they are so worried. They never wanted this to happen. They didn't want their loved one to go into a residence. This is not what they wanted, but it's happening. And so often I'll actually get a call back, not in the first few days, but a couple of weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks later. And then all of a sudden, there's an adaptation period. Your loved one is adapting to the new environment. You are starting to get a little more sleep. You're back in your own place and you're able to see your loved one on a daily basis, every couple of days, and you're getting your life back. So that is common. That's not always the case, okay? I don't want to mislead you, but it's all part of taking care of yourself. And sometimes we get so worked up worrying about what it would be, and we create these worst case scenarios. So always remember, you do also have to take care of yourself, despite you're doing the best for your loved one. All right.